the ideology supporting the caste system, right? And that was these religious belief systems, a combination of the ideas of reincarnation and karma seemed to work to keep people in their place, to sort of preempt or prevent those at the very bottom, the untouchables, from thinking that they had a right, maybe even from the idea occurring to them at all that they ought to complain about what was happening to them and change it, rise up in the world, right? Because they were raised in a set of, within a set of beliefs that told them that if they were on the bottom, it was likely because they had misbehaved in the past, so they got what they deserved, right? That probably they had transformed into form of life, the untouchables, in this present round of existence, in the eternal cycles of life, ended up there because of violations of the codes of behavior in the past, right? So the whole idea there is that you have this ideology, a system of beliefs, and it works in support of the status quo, the way things are right now, the caste system as it exists, right? So I would say that's the central idea of the ideology of stratification. Okay, let me give you some of these are the nuts and bolts of an ideology for the class system. Okay, this is the kind of system we live in. Marx was somebody that examined, and people influenced by Marx, somebody who examined the beliefs and values and other sort of non-material cultural dimensions supporting a class system or supporting the inequalities, okay, the uneven distributions of wealth and good health and reputation and privilege and so on, okay, within it. I'm going to point right away to, capitalist class ideologies. The first one, this idea of meritocracy, if you remember that idea. Meritocracy is this idea, it's a system in which prevails the idea that where you are is where you deserve to be because of what you've done in the past. You've achieved it, okay, on your own strength, okay, on your own, as a result of your own efforts. And then the idea is that, okay, in a system, an economic system like our own, in which we have a market system, right? That's where, jobs and goods and so on, those are how it's primarily distributed. You go into the marketplace and find it, and sellers compete with each other and so forth. And the idea is that to the extent that you live in a free market system or believe that the market system is, free, that is, everyone, the rules apply to all in exactly the same way, and you kind of start at the starting gate. The idea is in such a system, okay, you're going to get what you deserve, okay? There's going to be, I think I used this metaphor or scenario the other day. It's as if at time 1, T1, somebody fires a starting gun. On your mark, get set, go. Everyone try to compete with each other, okay, for whatever it is you're aiming for in life, materially and otherwise, certain kinds of jobs, income, level of wealth, and so on and so forth, okay? And here's the idea. To the extent that ideas, beliefs that you live in a meritocracy, you live in this kind of system, okay, where everyone has a fair fighting chance to get where they are in life, okay? What happens there, actually, in order to get this idea across, I needed to talk about two other things, and these are central ideas: equality of opportunity and equality of condition. Okay. So equality of opportunity refers to the fact that, legally speaking, okay, whether it's enshrined in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, in some kind of legislation that's been passed, in some other formal sense, equality of opportunity says that formally / legally, everyone has the same opportunities as everyone else for X, whatever X might be, getting a certain kind of job, getting into school, being able to reside in a certain area of, you know, the state or the city or what have you, okay? That legally, okay, those opportunities are open to everyone regardless of all kinds of social properties like background, class, what family you come from, and so on and so forth, okay? Okay, so equal treatment under the law, by the law, is this idea of equality of opportunity. And here's the idea here. In a capitalist, one kind of ideology works in the following way. Let me see if this is right. Okay, it tends to emphasize, I'll put an asterisk here, it emphasizes equality of opportunity. I think this is right. I think we live in a society in which we're always told that we're lucky to live here because, you know, we have equality of opportunity. Everyone has the same chance by law. Okay, to the extent that the laws are right and they're, you know, applied equally and everywhere in the same way. Okay, everyone has the same chance. Okay, to get ahead in the world, to make what they want of themselves, because the laws, okay, apply to everyone in the same way, and the laws actually state, okay, that you can't discriminate on the basis of class, creed, or what have you. Okay, and let's assume that that's fair and that those laws work exactly the way they should. The idea is this: the ideology works by emphasizing this in a way that conceals another kind of condition we should worry about: equality of condition. Okay, so you can have equality of opportunity, in which legally, by law, everyone has exactly the same chance as everyone else. While if you take a look at things like the kinds of the family they came from and the resources of that family, levels of education, connections that may be important in obtaining jobs and getting good tutors, et cetera, et cetera. If you take a look at the, let's call it the basket of assets, okay, assets being like, you know, housing, education, and all that kind of stuff, all those sort of material and non-material advantage baskets of assets. Those baskets of assets might be very unequally distributed as between communities, neighborhoods, families, and so on. Right? I think you can see that, right? You may have, look, the law applies equally to two different families, but those two different families can be extremely different from one another in terms of, you know, wealth and what they're able to offer the child. So you could say that from an equality of opportunity perspective, yes, everyone starts at the starting gate together, right? No one has a head start. So you think of like a race, right? So what if it was the case that one person it's 100 yards that you're running, 100 meters, whatever the case may be, and one person gets to start like 10 meters ahead of the other one. Well, that's not fair, right? Equality of opportunity says everyone starts at the starting line. However, it may be that according to, there may not be equality of condition. And if there's not equality of condition, it may still be the case that, you know, some people start 10 meters down the track before others. Right? But that you don't, the idea is that the ideology trains you either not to see that or to discount its importance. Okay. So that's the idea. I think that's actually probably the case. Especially if you take a look, this is just kind of a side note, there's surveys that are given internationally that try to get, whose questions are formed in such a way that they try to uncover the extent to which people think equality of opportunity is important or equality of condition is important. And it's been revealed that on average, respondents in the United States de-emphasize equality of condition as being important. Okay, it's much more important on average for U.S. American respondents that we have equality of opportunity. Equality of condition, yeah, whatever. That's not something we're worried about. Whereas it turns out on average in Europe, European countries, they're more concerned that they try to equalize as much as they can the material conditions, the basket of assets, okay, that children begin with. Okay, sort of this race, as it were. Okay, let me go ahead and then a second one really quickly. Social Darwinism. You may have heard of this already. Anybody ever heard that term before? Social Darwinism? Maybe. So you're probably familiar already with this guy named Darwin, right? He came up with one theory of evolution by what he called natural selection, and some people use as a shorthand for that theory the idea that that life is a game of the survival of the fittest. Okay. So, and Social Darwin says that if you have inequality in a class system, it's a result of these natural processes that are at work in the entire natural world, whether it be among viruses and bacteria, frogs, you name it. Any living creature in the natural world is going to be subject to these processes. And the idea, let me just take a quick example. This is how actually this natural selection scenario is supposed to work. I don't know why I need to draw this. I guess just because I have this drawing thing here, I think I like to do it. And this is supposed to be a frog, and you have one frog that can see little flies really well, so it's got good eyes. You have another frog that has not such good eyes. I'll draw really big eyes, right? So here's the idea. You got a population of frogs, okay, and one of the things they have to do to survive is they have to eat. One of the things they eat is these little flies. If because of some mutation that has a positive impact on their ability to see well. Okay, this frog has that mutation. It's got better eyes. What it can do is it can see better than the other frogs. It can outcompete the other frogs in getting flies, right? And so it stands a better chance of surviving longer. If it survives longer, it has a better chance of having greater reproductive success, having baby frogs, right? And the idea is that over the generations, what'll happen is the number of frogs with the fitter frog, this is the fitter frog. The fitter frog is actually the frog that, because of some advantage, better eyes, it has more offspring than other frogs do. Therefore, the number of frogs with that new trait is going to increase relative to the other frogs, right? Over the generations, it's going to have more and more children relative to these. And pretty soon you could say generation after generation after generation of these frogs, the frogs with the good eyes will come to predominate in the population. Right? That's one kind of intergenerational process that is supposed to happen through the process of natural selection. So the fittest frogs become the most numerous frogs in a given population. That's one thing that can happen. So here's what social Darwinism says. Social Darwinism was developed in the late 1800s, or ideas that are called social Darwinists began to circulate in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the United States, perhaps elsewhere, but especially here. And the idea was that if there are gross like disparities, differences between the haves, the extremely wealthy, and the have-nots, the extremely impoverished, that is simply a reflection of the kind of process that we saw in the frog pond, right? Those with the better traits, smarter, more ambitious, or what have you, right? They're going to rise, right? They're going to be successful, more successful like the frogs. And that's all you see is this kind of sorting process whereby the fittest rise and the less fit sink to the bottom. Okay? And this theory, when did this happen? This happened during a period of time in the United States when inequality was rising and becoming more and more conspicuous, was becoming very dramatic. It was during this period of time, it was the decades after the end of the Civil War, when you began to see great fortunes made in steel, in railways, in oil, et cetera, et cetera. You began to see these names like, maybe you've heard these names, Carnegie, for example, that's one big name. Rockefeller and so on, Vanderbilt and the like. Okay, so with massive wealth, opulent mansions that they lived in, so on and so forth. And at the same time, what you saw is a burgeoning population of urban indigent people, slums expanding and so on, right? And so you saw this very dramatic, I guess, rise in inequality in the United States. And that was when people began to speak about social Darwinism. Look, this is just the result of a natural process that's at work everywhere. There's no sense in getting too upset about it or fighting against it. It's not unjust, it's just the outcome of a natural process. Okay, so in that sense, you could say that social Darwinism, this idea of the cream rises to the top, the fittest rise to the top, sort of legitimates, makes it seem more legitimate because it makes it seem the result of a natural process. Now, it's actually very easy to show that that is a form of ideology, or let's use that term, false consciousness. It's misleading, it's a distortion of reality, or you should be suspicious of it because, go back to the frog example. So in biology, if you have a situation in which there are individual organisms that have this advantageous trait, they can run faster, they can see better, they have a stronger immune system, et cetera, that allows them to survive and reproduce more frequently than their competitors. What's going to happen over the generations? Their number is going to increase, right? Well, immediately that tells you that this idea of social Darwinism just gets it wrong from the get-go. Why? Because it's saying that the cream rises to the top, the more advantage rises to the top, but they're by far and away a tiny minority in the population, right? So the story, it doesn't even fit. Remember that, because you may hear or run across social Darwinists. You don't hear people labeling their own accounts of how the population sorts it out into, those with the better traits on top, those with worse traits on the bottom, and so on and so forth. They won't label their own set of ideas as social Darwinists, but that's essentially what they are. Okay, and just remember that unless you see the more successful also increasing in number, you don't have, the kind of thing they're talking about. Anyway, okay, good enough. The theology of stratification. Let me move on here to that. Okay, this one here. Okay, so the first theory of stratification, and by the way, in the name of not going on longer than I promised. Maybe I won't do all three of these theories today. Plus, they're in your textbook. Point that out. But this first one here, for sure. These two fellows right here, their names aren't important for you to know, but it's an order theory or a structural functional theory for why there's any stratification whatsoever. Right? So these guys, Kingsley Davis and Wilbert Moore, they began by asking the following kind of question. Look, if we see inequality in almost every society that we've observed, there's always stratification. There's always groups at the top and groups at the bottom. It doesn't matter whether it's a caste system, a feudal state system, or a capitalist system, right? There's always these ranks, okay? Well, maybe they're always there because they serve some kind of purpose. They wouldn't be there if they didn't. That's their suspicion. So their theory comes up with the benefits of stratification. They say there's a good reason for them to be there. In fact, they serve the whole of society. So even those at the bottom are better off in a society in which they're at the bottom than they would be in a society where there's no stratification. Okay, that's kind of the counterintuitive or challenging supposition that they ask you to consider. Okay, take two societies, one with stratification, inequality, one with no inequality, everyone's equal, and they say take person A, who's at the bottom. They would actually be likely to be better off in a society with inequality than they would be, okay, if they were in a society that was equal. Okay. As to whether or not I myself am persuaded by that position, I would say yes and no, but more no than yes. But I'm not going to go into why that is right now. Here's their argument. Their argument goes, in any given society, you're going to have some people, okay, a limited number of people, relatively, who have certain kinds of talents. They're born with certain gifts that are going to become what they call functionally important, okay, in society. So just think about the idea of what are sometimes called natural inequalities as opposed to social or artificial inequalities, and these would be ones you're born with. Some people, just because of physiology and physical, makeup, I can't kick a ball very far. I know people who can kick a ball a lot farther than me. There's an inequality, okay? Right? We're unequal. We're different in that respect. I am not naturally gifted in mathematics. I wish I were. In fact, I've tried to work really hard at becoming at math. So I got to work my butt off. I can see some people who just get it right away, right? Right. So there's something about the brain that makes people unequal in that respect, and you keep on going, right? You can list many, many different things in which people are naturally unequal because of what they're born with. So those are natural inequalities. And what they're saying is that there are certain kinds of faculties or capabilities or abilities that are going to serve people in jobs that are very important, functionally important, meaning that when you carry out those jobs, they help lots and lots of other people. They make society a better place. So you can actually rank jobs they're suggesting, okay, in terms of how important they are, okay? But there's some skills, there's some inborn capabilities which are widely distributed in the population. Like most people are able to do things. There are some abilities which are relatively rare in the population. Like only a few people are born within a population able to do certain kinds of things. those are assumptions that the theory makes. So every one of these assumptions are things that you can actually question. You can ask, is that the case? Okay. If I'm going to follow you in this argument, I want to know for sure that that assumption is actually correct. So you can investigate these assumptions, and ought to, in fact. Okay. So two assumptions are this idea of like, are certain kinds of abilities, are they truly rare in society? Like only some people will get them, have them. Okay. And then is it the actual case? Like, I mean, how plausible is it to rank different jobs or occupations according to, you know, functional importance? Okay. You might want to see how people are actually doing. Okay, but let's just assume that that's right, and we're agreed on what that means. Here's what they say. Okay, they say what then happens is society develops over the course of time an incentive system, or what's called a motivational system of rewards, material rewards, prestige, and diversions. Okay, so it has a rank of incomes, for example. Incomes at the very top, okay, really high salaries, and you know, all the way down to really low hourly wages. Prestige, okay, you'll have jobs at the very top. The most functionally important jobs will have the highest rewards. They'll receive the most prestige, like you'll bow down. Okay, oh my God, that's so important. You're so wonderful. It's an awesome job you do, and I take off my hat, and so on. And then other things as well, kind of like fringe benefits, leisure time, in which to spend your, you know, high material rewards on, I don't know, buying a cabin by the lake, or I don't know, going off on exotic vacations in exotic locales, and so on and so forth. Okay, so once again, it's a pretty simple, straightforward theory, but the idea, one other assumption is this, that to get yourself trained, to go through the period of time it takes to study and acquire skills, apprenticeship, and all that, to do the most important kinds of jobs, okay, is a real pain in the butt. It's arduous. It's difficult. It's so difficult that people would not do it unless they had the lure, unless they were lured by really high incentives, by a big salary. Unless at the very end of the road they saw big salaries, they wouldn't do it because it's too difficult, it's too much of a pain to go through the process of getting it. Okay, so the idea is that you require this this sort of this stratification system, this system of rank. The highest salaries at the top, smaller as you go down, in order to lure those people, with those rare individuals with the capabilities of becoming, say, a doctor, okay, or a chief executive officer of a large business that produced important goods for consumers out there, or a leader of some governmental office, okay, that help run the affairs of a big city or what have you. Think of some kind of important position that required a certain skill set, and that there's only a few individuals in the population who have the capabilities of molding, you know, their natural gifts into those skills. Okay, you need those high salaries. You need that incentive package to lure them. And then the idea is that once they carry out their jobs, they serve everyone else. They make everyone else's life better. Okay, because doctors take care of people, save people's lives. elected officials in government, if they do their jobs well, they, you know, that likewise, and it goes, and so on. Okay, as you move down, okay, as the compensation packages become smaller and smaller, the idea is that, well, they're smaller and smaller for one, because what it takes to do those jobs are capabilities that most people have. So you don't have to work really hard to find people to do them. Okay. And, you know, quite frankly, they're not quite as important. The services they render to others aren't, apparently, you know, it's an idea that they don't, the service isn't quite as important. It doesn't pack quite the same punch. So here's a question for you guys. Provided that what I've just said makes sense, that you're following the reasoning here, right? And so the idea is that this kind of ranked system of rewards would arise in order to find the best people for the most important jobs so that they can benefit the rest of the society maximally. If you follow that reasoning, can you think of any cases where it's hard, that are hard to fit into this model? So for example, can you think of any handsomely rewarded occupations where you're kind of wondering, yeah, and how is what they do making everyone else's life a lot better? Or conversely, can you think of examples of people who make very little? Their compensation package is very low, and yet you're saying to yourself, the job they do benefits everyone in a very obvious kind of way. I'm kind of curious to see if anybody might think of an example. High salaries, but not sure what kind of service is being rendered, how it's making your life better. Or conversely, low salaries, and yet the service seems.
I was thinking like for the higher ones, like people who volunteer for like homeless people and stuff like that, like they help everybody else. Will that be a good case?
I think so. So here's what I'm seeing. You have some kind of volunteer workers, maybe performing what's called like social services, right? They're working with the homeless. They're trying to rescue people in a very, very dire situation that nobody would want to be in. I mean, so stressful and yeah, and dangerous and so on. And so, wow, it just strikes you as like obvious beyond telling what a precious service that they're performing for humanity, right? They're rescuing people in a way, you know, from and yet they're volunteers, and so the work that they do, let's say they're actually receiving some kind of compensation from donations, right? There's some salary, they're working in the nonprofit sector, but you know, they're not pulling in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, much less millions of dollars a year, right? Very small, and yet, okay, yeah. So I think that, so right, small salaries where it looks like the service being rendered, at least in your estimation, is very high. Yeah, exactly. Now, let me just mention that, so people who work with this kind of theory, it's not like they haven't thought about these difficulties and come up with ways of responding to them. So here's one thing that they might say in response. And then you can judge whether you find their response convincing at all. They might say, well, look, the reason it actually does fit, because what the volunteer is able to do requires capabilities, maybe empathy for one, just, your normal energies. I mean, your basic average level of intelligence, maybe a certain degree of social intelligence, that's, a little maybe higher than average, however you measure social intelligence. But the capabilities that are required to do competent volunteer work with the homeless is not that rare in the population. Many people can do it. Okay, so in other words, we don't really require much of a salary to lure those people, to recruit those people. We find them anyway, right? So that's how they might say your case actually fits. Whereas you might say, I'm not satisfied with that argument because I actually think that you may think that their compensation package is disproportional to what they receive. Okay, to that the importance of their job is disproportionate to what they receive in money for that job. Okay, so this theory does seem to require some kind of a sense of proportionality. Okay, the importance of the job should be proportional, one, to how much you make. I guess the one thing that's different here is this idea of rarity. Okay, they basically say that the jobs up here receiving the big bucks are ones that require talents which are rare. Okay. Now it just occurs to me as I'm doing this and I'm kind of thinking aloud that one of the big assumptions is this idea of rarity of natural talents, but also how much it actually takes to get people those skills. Okay? Maybe with a education system that tries to recruit as many people as possible and get them the skills that they're required, you could actually increase the number of possible candidates out there through changes in the education system, in which case the rarity would actually decrease. But anyway, I'm just kind of thinking aloud. I don't know if that makes sense at all. Let me do this. I bet you can think of, Katie, did you happen to think of a case of like people say your volunteer workers don't make very much but do really important work? How about people who make all kinds of stuff, but you're kind of like, I'm not sure how much they're improving the rest of society? Can you think of an example like that? Or can anybody else, or Darius or Anna?
I couldn't really think of an example for like the upper, like people who make more money.
Yeah.
I mostly just thought of examples of people like towards the bottom.
So did you have others like the health or the volunteer worker?
I was gonna say like either teachers or like factory workers.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Okay.
both of those people are pretty important to a functioning society, and so
yeah, teachers, I mean, are educators, right? So I mean, in a society where certain kinds of knowledge and intellectual skills are important, obviously, instructors are going to be important. Again, I think the response would be by these people, they'd say it still fits there because the abilities, the capabilities it takes to be a teacher are fairly widely distributed in society. I mean, that would be the kind of argument that they would make. But absolutely, these are examples that fit really well. I saw you, Anna.
I was also thinking like the farmers, how they help society, like they distribute the food like all around the country, and the outsides of the country. So that
Yeah,
will be on the higher.
right. So you're thinking of all of you guys, with education, with factory workers making, cars, right? In our society, automotive vehicles are indispensable, right? You can't do without them. So they're important. And likewise, people that produce food, obviously, that we don't have to say anything about the importance of food, right? Um, and again, I think the response would be that, well, those are occupations that they're not at the very upper ranks because the capabilities required for doing them are fairly widely distributed. They're not that rare. What we need, and again, the assumption is for the jobs that find themselves at the top, they're the jobs that are really, really hard to do, that it's a rare person who's capable of doing them really, really well because they're born with the right stuff. Very few people are born with the right stuff, and therefore, and it's really hard. It takes a long period of time, and the training is very difficult. All the years of school, the internships, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is that to get those rare candidates who could do this job, to lure them to go through that rough process, we need to make the salaries and the benefits and the prestige rewards really, really high. Otherwise, we won't find the right people to do the job. I think that's the case that they're really making. So I'm gonna move on. I think there's more to say about that. There's more ways in which we could critique it and so on. But let me finish with one more of these theories. I won't get to the third one, okay? And I'll just start this one here. So that last theory has one of the groups that critiques that last theory actually tends to prefer this theory. So people that are influenced by Marx's ideas, who come from a conflict point of view, tend to see this last theory. So think about this. They tend to see this last theory as performing an ideological function. A theory like this, they suggest, can actually be seen as an ideology of the class system because what it says is inequality is good. The inequality that's there, this theory tells us, is there for a good reason. Okay? It's even suggesting that somebody at the bottom of a society like this is actually better off than they would be if they were in an equal society, because in an equal society, you wouldn't have had a way of luring the best person to train themselves to provide a service to everyone, including those at the bottom. Right? That's the argument, okay? But if you find a number of the assumptions here questionable, okay, as conflict theorists might, then you're left with seeing this theory as a theory that actually supports a social arrangement, one of unequal distribution of goods, that you could judge as unjust. Okay, so that theory may actually serve to make an unjust system appear just. Who knows? Okay, that may be. Okay, you may decide that they're correct in saying that. So here's what a conflict theorist would suggest. So this guy here, Eric Olin Wright, who is that? Why is his name there? His name is there because he developed the theory I'm just going to talk about in just 1 second. He passed away years ago, but what he did is he tried to update Marx's theory of capitalism, in which, if you remember, what you have is you have the working class that works for a certain period of time. They pay off their wage through what they produce, but then they keep on working. And they worked up and beyond the amount that paid for their wage, and that's called surplus value. And so you get this guy, and he's working away, and he's producing stuff for the person who hired them, okay, the capitalist. And this extra stuff, this surplus, is actually owned by this guy here, right? So that's one way of explaining inequality, okay, that you could try to explain inequality, the distribution of surplus. So Eric Olin Wright, what he does is he says, look, the societies we actually find ourselves in are really complicated. The number of occupations and what goes into these occupations is so complex that it's hard to shoehorn them, force them to fit into this two-class framework, okay? But what he does is he retains some of the properties of capitalists and proletarians, okay? And then says, let's just stick with those properties and ask to what extent they apply to the different kinds of jobs that we actually find in contemporary capitalist societies. So the two kinds of properties are this. This right here, okay, the capitalist properties would be you control other people's work. You hire them, so you actually, in a way, have rented out their capacity to work. And so you tell them what to make, how long to make it, under what conditions, what are the terms of employment, what do you have to do to keep your job, what would you have to do in order to jeopardize your job, and so on, okay? Also, they have great decision-making powers. And one of the decision-making powers that they have has to do with investments. So they have lots and lots of money, capital to begin with. They own lots of stuff, including financial assets, stocks and bonds and so on, mostly stock in their own companies. And what they can do is, if they want, they could decide to take their what they own and move it somewhere, shift it somewhere else, disinvest and reinvest elsewhere. Right? They could close down a workplace. They could close down a production facility and maybe move it elsewhere if they wanted to. Right? So that's a kind of decision that impacts many other people's lives. Okay, so that's what great decision-making powers consist in. The ability, when you make a decision, it also has a kind of knock-on effect on many other people's lives. Okay. Then the proletarian, if you remember, they're like the working class. They're the factory workers back in Marx's days. They don't control labor. Their labor is controlled. They're told what to do, what to make, how to make it, and so on. They have very little decision-making powers. They can decide what to do with their wages, and that affects themselves and maybe their families, but that's probably about it. Okay, kind of the ripple effect of their decisions is going to be very tightly circumscribed. It's not going to go very far. And they probably have no real materials to invest. Maybe they have some savings, a few $1,000s or something, but it's nothing that's going to affect whether a factory closes or opens, or how many new workers to hire on, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you take those two properties. Those are the two properties that Eric Olin Wright, he says, so these are capitalist properties, these are proletarian properties, and then on the basis of that, you can take a look. So people, that end up on these magazines, if you've ever heard of them. There's the Fortune magazine, there's Forbes magazine, and these are old magazines, and every single year or regularly they'll publish lists of the 100 or the 500 or however many it is wealthiest people in the world, right? And so they would include, right, Forbes list would include people like Bill Gates, another guy's investment banker, Warren Buffett. There was some guy, Zuckerberg, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and the list goes on and on and on. I myself am not a regular reader of Forbes, and so I'm not that familiar with the list, and so my kind of working knowledge of extraordinarily wealthy, right? They have the people towards the top of the list their wealth usually exceeds about at least a third, maybe even half of the countries of the world, the GDP of the countries of the world, right? So that would be the ruling class, what he calls the ruling class. They have these kinds of powers right here. I mean, they can take their money and they can shift it. They can disinvest, reinvest in a way that affects hundreds of thousands of people's lives. At the very bottom, okay, you have people who may not be employed or whose existence may be supported by, government expenditures and so on. So the poor. The working class would come closest. Okay, people who work in a whole range of occupations of varying kinds. But the deal here is that pretty much all they have is their capacity to work, and they hire that out. They rent that out. So they're the working class. Right? It could be blue collar, it could be white collar, but they sell their labor power for wages. Now, Anna mentioned farmers. So if you take like an old-fashioned independent farmer, a self-employed farmer, who's not working for a large agri firm or what have you, right? He's his own boss. He's a capitalist, right? Because he's an owner of the means of production. Maybe actually turns a profit. But usually the thing is they have very little decision-making powers of this kind up here, right? Okay, and for that reason, he says, no, we're not going to include them. We're not going to lump them into the capitalist class, okay? Okay, so you could say owners of mom and pop shops. So that is, owners are kind of small scale capitalists. He would say, we need a category, okay, that belongs just to them. Now, to finish out, one of the innovations of this theory, this conflict point of view, and so it's a conflict point of view because it does actually say that there are conflicts of interest. What's good for one may not be good for another. Their interests may come into conflict with one another, and there can be something of a struggle over who gets the surplus, how the surplus, the extra stuff in society, is distributed. Okay? And so that's a classic kind of conflict approach. What he adds to this approach is the following element that's somewhat new, is what he calls contradictory class location. So he notes that whereas Marx and many people influenced by Marx in the decades following Marx's death believed that eventually there would develop this conflict between the two classes where the proletariat, okay, that vastly outnumbers, okay, the capitalists, a very small class, there would be this kind of final showdown between the two of them in which just through sheer number, the proletariat or working class would sort of overpower. And maybe not even in the sense of violent conflict, but just in a sense of kind of negotiation. And they would have a revolution. A revolution simply meaning a set of transformative decisions or changes that altered the way society ran. Well, that really never happened. Okay, there are places in the world that claim that they brought that about, like in the Soviet Union, in China, and so on, where they actually declared that there had been a revolution and the proletariat had taken over. But from Marx's own point of view, that was a mischaracterization of what happened. And so a revolution, in the sense that Marx, this transformative event that Marx forecast or hope for, or whatever, never really happened. And what Eric Olin Wright suggests as a reason for that is the emergence of this class, that this class of managers, think of managers of restaurants or food franchises, McDonald's or Pizza Hut or what have you, supervisors who are not themselves board members or CEOs, who are largely owners and run big corporations, business professionals in firms. What he called the professional managerial class is a kind of hybrid between the proletariat and the capitalist. So if you think of like a manager of a chain restaurant, they do control other people's labor. They supervise them and they tell them what to do and so on. And they're rewarded. They tend to be rewarded more handsomely, better, have higher salaries than the people they manage. But at the same time, they're also not the boss, right? They're not part of the ruling class. They themselves belong to, are employees of other people, okay, who do own these enterprises, or who possess controlling shares, okay, in these enterprises. So the idea is that they have control over others, but they are also controlled by top and middle managers. Okay, so in that sense, it's contradictory. It's as though they almost feel split loyalties, divided loyalties. On the one hand, they're capable of identifying with the working class because they themselves are kind of working class. So they're able to identify downward, you could say, while also in certain other respects, they identify with the ruling class. In fact, they may even want to become part of the ruling class one day, and they dream of joining the ranks, okay, of the capitalists. So it's though they're tugged in both directions. That's why it's called contradictory class location. You're located in a place that kind of tears you apart in a certain sense. It's not saying like you're psychologically, torn and battered and bruised, but in a certain objective sense, there are forces that are pulling you from different directions. And to that extent, to the extent that you have a workforce whose ranks are increasingly comprise this segment, that is probably going to siphon off, as it were, potential revolutionary fervor. Okay, it's going to be hard to persuade this group to join one or the other side. They're kind of caught in the middle, and they're not going to. So that is going to create this kind of buffer zone between the working class and the capitalists. balance. There's not going to be this big kind of two-part polarization between these big classes that's going to result in a kind of final showdown leading to a revolution. Okay. Well, for our purposes, what's really most important about this, so to finish, what's important about this conflict point of view is it tries to capture some of the complexity of modern society that maybe Marx's model isn't able to capture, and then it adds this kind of layer of complexity with contradictory class location. Okay. But one thing, just kind of looking forward, one thing that it will do is it does force our attention on the existence of surplus. And there's ways of measuring surplus that we'll see when we get to kind of an account of class and inequality in today's society. We live in a society that's increasingly wealthy and wealthy, and wealthier and wealthier and wealthier every year because of increasing productivity. And yet we're in a society in which inequality has only increased. So what that means, very quickly said, is that this growing surplus, the surplus is increasing, and more of this surplus is going to the ruling class and less to the rest as a proportion. Okay? And so in a way, this conflict point of view, it really is, what's the word I want to use, buttressed or fits in well with some of the actual facts that confront us